This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. The inauguration of a new president is always a day of ceremony, and this one was different, but no exception. Security in the nation's capital was extraordinary, yet President Joe Biden found new ways to make an impression, even walking those last steps to the White House with his wife and family members. Not far behind, Vice President Kamala Harris, her husband, and their family made their way along the parade route. The streets, which are normally lined with thousands of cheering supporters, instead were lined with security, media, and a few people. Online, the parade across America featured an indigenous touch. Among those featured were members of the Native American Women Warriors Association, the nation's first all-female Native American color guard, and TikTok star Nathan Dogface Apodaca, Northern Arapaho. He made an appearance on his skateboard, waving an American flag and skating to Dreams, the Fleetwood Mac song that helped catapult him to internet fame. In his first hours as president, Biden started the formal reversal of former President Donald Trump's policies with a series of executive actions to reverse his predecessor's orders on immigration, climate change, and handling the coronavirus pandemic. One executive order will review the status of Bears Ears, a national monument that was reduced by the Trump administration. There was also an order to end the Keystone XL pipeline permitting process. Emboldened by those actions, leaders of 4 tribes are requesting Biden cancel the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline. Leaders of the Yankton Sioux Tribe, Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, the Oglala Sioux Tribe, and the Standing Rock Tribe sent a letter to Biden on Tuesday requesting he take quick and decisive action on the Dakota Access Pipeline within the first 10 days of his administration. President Joe Biden says the country is beginning what may be the toughest and deadliest period of the virus, and the federal government is responding with a new national strategy to ramp up vaccinations and testing and increase the use of masks. Masks are now required for travel and on all federal installations. The new administration said it will pay attention to the tribal nations that have been hit hard by the pandemic by addressing inequity in access to vaccines, equipment, and other tools. The president is asking Congress to enact legislation to speed up funding for both economic relief and to support public health efforts, including $20 billion for tribes. Dr. Anthony Fauci, now the country's chief medical advisor, announced Wednesday the United States was rejoining the World Health Organization and would work with other countries on a global response.
The Biden administration also intends to be fully engaged in advancing global health, supporting global health security, and the global health security agenda.
Biden has set the goal to deliver 100 million shots in his first 100 days in office. He has also directed the Federal Emergency Management Agency to begin setting up vaccination centers aimed to have 100 up and running by the end of the month. He's ordering the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to begin a program to make vaccines available through local pharmacies starting next month. And he's mobilizing the Public Health Service to assist communities in their vaccination efforts. The Arizona National Guard is assisting with efforts for coronavirus testing on tribal lands. Guard personnel made their way to White River on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. There they distributed and collected samples at a mobile testing site. According to a statement from the U.S. Department of Defense, those samples on their way to a state lab for testing. Arizona had the worst state COVID-19 weekly diagnosis rate, with 1 out of every 107 people diagnosed with COVID-19 from January 6th to the 20th. The state reports their totals are now more than 649,000 cases and a little more than 10,000 deaths. And COVID-19 vaccines are reaching Brazil's vast Amazon state, and with the current state of hospitals, their needs are critical. The governor opened the vaccination campaign, saying it will be aggressively pursued. The campaign began with the inoculation of 33-year-old Wanda Ortega, a Witutu indigenous tribal member and nursing aide. Ortega received the first dose of Coronavac, a vaccine developed by Sinovac, a company in Beijing. and doctors in Manaus, the biggest city in the Amazon rainforest, must choose which COVID-19 patients can breathe amid dwindling oxygen stocks. The country is beginning an immunization program with 6 million doses of CoronaVac in multiple states. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant. Could Kim Teehee finally get a seat in Congress? Her tribe is exercising its treaty right to have a representative in the House. She'll join us to give us an update when we come back. In 2019, Kim Teehee was named the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma's first delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. After a promise made almost 200 years ago from the 1835 Treaty of Newchota, the treaty promised the nation could appoint a delegate to the House of Representatives after being forced off their land. She previously served President Barack Obama as the first ever policy advisor for Native American affairs in the White House Domestic Policy Council for 3 years. She's also the Director of Government Relations for the Cherokee Nation and Senior Vice President of Government Relations for Cherokee Nation businesses. She joins us now. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you for having me.
So where do we stand? Has the House agreed to have you sit? Do we know what's going to happen next?
Well, thank you for asking. You know, last March was our last visit to DC. We are still on travel restriction because of COVID, and we had wonderful discussions, no opposition, but COVID struck. And as we know, all of Indian Country had to quickly pivot to addressing the great needs of their communities and their citizens. And so we, like everybody else, hustled and started working with Congress, and then obviously the election. So where things stand now is we are presently in revisiting those conversations that we had. And like everybody else, waiting for our new Interior Secretary to be confirmed by the Senate so that the administration can express its views, which we believe will be a supportive view, so that Speaker Pelosi can take the action necessary to seat Cherokee Nation's delegate in fulfillment of that treaty right.
How does that work in terms of the process in Congress?
Well, the Speaker of the House has the legal authority to seat a delegate. It does not require an act of Congress. It does not require Senate approval either, because as you know, the treaty was already ratified by the Senate and signed by the President and is still the supreme law of the land. And so we believe it would require, the easiest step would be structuring a rule that the House votes on, up or down. And that would be the easiest, fastest way to seat this delegate position.
The whole history of delegates is really interesting to me because it was actually one of the first things that Congress did. And it's been used throughout basically the country's history, yet despite these promises, there's never been one reaching out to Indian Country.
That's correct. You know, there are U.S. territories, and even though there are similarities between my delegate position in U.S. territories, there are also differences. The delegates that you're referring to by U.S. territories did require an act of Congress, and they are elected. And whereas my delegate position is appointed, and I'm appointed by the Cherokee Nation's elected officials.
Do you think there are other treaties with that provision, and also just the bigger principle of representation from government to government? Do you think this is something that is kind of a wedge into a larger discussion?
Absolutely. The larger discussion is that the United States honors its treaty rights. It doesn't matter how old they are when they are still valid and still the supreme law of the land. The delegate issue should not be anything that any member of Congress should be fearful of. There are other treaty rights that are similar to ours, but it doesn't open the floodgate to others. There are two other treaties that have similar provisions. Ours is the most clear, but I do think it would go a long way in fulfilling treaty responsibilities.
How do you plan to approach the job? What committees are you interested in, and how do you move public policy in that role?
Absolutely. Well, since my constituent would be the Cherokee Nation, the government, our priorities are not too different from the priorities we see across Indian Country. Funding, for example, one of the very first priorities that we would have would be making sure that at least those essential services, like at the Indian Health Service, are mandatorily funded. Right now, they're discretionary funded. And so as we've seen just last year, when we were facing a government shutdown of December 11th, tribes were very taxed to try to not only spend down their CRF funds, do wind down of their regular budgets, but to also develop contingency plans in the event there is a shutdown. When shutdowns occur over discretionary dollars, the programs that those discretionary dollars fund, get harmed. And so that means Indian Health Services, that means public safety is at issue. And so tribes who have dollars to spare to supplement those funds during shutdown and disruptions are better off. But in reality, we need mandatory funding. I mean, those promises and those funds come as a result of the federal trust responsibility. And when there are gaps and lapses in funding, then that's, in my opinion, a breach of that responsibility. So mandatory funding, especially for Indian Health Service. And that particular proposal for the Indian Health Service is actually one of the commitments that are made in President Biden's and Vice President Harris's Tribal Nations plan.
Well, in fact, Kim, you mentioned partnership with the Biden administration and Secretary-designate Deb Haaland. How do you see that work playing out in this administration, with working with Congress, the tribes, kind of three-way pressure?
Well, I tell you, Indian country is blessed to have one of our own be in this historic position, right? We know oftentimes this position has not always been the best advocate for Indian country, but we think, with Congresswoman Haaland there, having served as a member of Congress, having worked on both sides of the aisle, having worked successfully with the Senate as well, and having successfully gotten bills through Congress, she knows her mission at Interior. We know that this administration is heavily focused on the pandemic, on the economy, on climate, on equity, and that every federal agency is going to be tasked with creating initiatives and having outputs based on those initiatives and making sure that all stakeholders are included. And we know that with at least Congresswoman Haaland in the Interior Department, she will always have tribal nations in mind. So I think she'll be very successful in implementing and executing policies and working well with Congress and with the federal family and the White House.
Already we're seeing Interior kind of being a success story with 2 more Native appointments to the Solicitor's Office this week. How do you think it's going to work across the rest of government? Do you think there'll be more Native Americans in appointed positions by the president?
I absolutely think so. I mean, I don't know if you realize there's also a Native American in the White House Presidential Personnel Office. Matt Dannenberg is there, and one of his portfolios includes Native placements. So I do believe that there is an active effort to try to make sure that Native Americans are reflected in the hires throughout the federal family. And so I hope and I believe that that will be done.
Of all the places where the need is dire as the judiciary, just 2 federal judges in the entire 870 Article 3 judges, how high a priority do you think that'll be?
I hope it's a big priority. You see, and one of the other top priorities in this administration is racial equity, addressing across the board systemic racism and making sure that the diversity of the United States is reflected in this administration. And that is not just the Interior Department appointments, right? It's across the board. It's every branch of government. It includes the judiciary. I was in the Obama administration whenever Diane Hemtewa was appointed. And I look forward to an opportunity for additional Native Americans. We have qualified Native American lawyers who have gone down the traditional path of what makes a successful judge nominee, which is clerking, going to a good school, and such. And in those who have had the opportunity to be on a tribal bench, they bring that diversity with them also to that nomination. And so I think we have enough qualified people to also choose from. And so my hope is that we get another judicial nominee in this administration.
Cherokee Nation, I mean, you've got the one hand a very favorable Biden administration. On the other hand, you have a state that's, let's just say, recalcitrant. How are you going to work out some of the issues from the federal perspective in Oklahoma?
Well, it's been, using COVID as the example, it's been in some instances a challenge. Cherokee Nation Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. is guided in the COVID response by science and compassion and culture. But we don't live in a bubble. We have very strict mask mandates. We do not have a workforce that's 100% in the office yet. I'm at home today, but we don't live in a bubble, and it's challenging when outside of the Cherokee Nation reservation, you have public schools that are still in session. You've got sporting events that are still ongoing. You have public gatherings. And so it makes it challenging. We're doing our best to educate on the necessity of wearing masks and social distancing. And we've added culture to that because it is our culture, like most tribes, to protect your elders. And so by making sure that our signage and our messaging is also offered in the Cherokee language, by making sure that our Cherokee first language speakers were among the first, along with healthcare workers, to receive the COVID vaccine has been helpful too. I mean, it tells you how precious they are. Both my parents, I'm lucky that I still have them both, are both Cherokee first language speakers. And so they received their COVID shot, as well as my aunts and uncles, in fact, who are also first language speakers. But it just says volumes about who we are as a people. Whenever we, by the way, are given the flexibility as a tribal sovereign should have to make those decisions on how to administer things like the vaccine. And so it's changing, but we're doing the best we can.
We only have about a minute left, but I wanted to ask, just pick up on that language theme. One of the things that struck me yesterday during the inauguration was Spanish language. What if native language was both part of the congressional and presidential routine, where it was just something we heard often?
I would love that. You look at other countries like New Zealand, where you have legal documents that are in native language. Not every tribal language has been preserved or has a syllabary. We're fortunate that we do, that we had a newspaper before statehood, before forced removal, that was printed in Cherokee and English. And so we are quite aggressive with our language immersion programs and also with our education of adults too, and also bringing elders into that system. But I would cherish the day that we are able to negotiate our agreements and have them printed out in Cherokee and translated in Cherokee too. We do have, a syllabary, and we do have, keyboards for our Apple computers and for other computers where the keyboard is all in the Cherokee language and the font is in the Cherokee language. We do have that, that piece of it. The other piece of it, though, is to obviously have more people who can speak the language and can read it.
Thank you, Kim Teehee, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
When we come back, we'll take another look at the historic inauguration of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Indian Country Today had a front row seat to history yesterday for the inauguration of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Our Deputy Managing Editor, Jourdan Bennett-Begay, was in the media stand in front of the White House, where she spent the day recording history. Jourdan joins us now. Welcome, Jourdan.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
This was such a very different inauguration with the pandemic and then, of course, the extra security. Maybe set the scene for us.
Yeah, of course. So again, this was an unusual inauguration. Even I was hearing multiple reports about even people here who are from DC and who've covered previous inaugurations that were saying this was, definitely a unique one. I did speak to an Al Jazeera reporter a couple of days ago, and he is, a lifelong DC resident, born and raised here, and he works here as well. And he's covered the 2008 Obama administration or inauguration. And even he was saying that typically, we only get 2 days of traffic and 2 days of road closures, but this time there was like a week worth, and you had to navigate a whole maze around the city. Bridges were closed. And then also the security perimeter was much more extensive and strict. Typically, it's a pretty tight security. The perimeter is really small, but this year it was very wide and spread. And it's such a hassle getting from the south side of the National Mall to the north side, because you have to go all the way around. And even he was just struck by it, just because, of the insurrection of the U.S. Capitol a couple weeks ago. But going into the metro, I mean, I had to walk a mile from the White House. And even when I arrived to the metro station, there were at least, more than 20 officers and troops there walking around and looking, keeping an eye on people who were wandering the streets. You had to go through, at least for media, we had to go through a couple of checkpoints. The first one was a bag check, and they definitely checked every nook and cranny in your bag. Like it took quite a while for that to get done. And then from, of course, media, we had to go through a checkpoint as well. But it's very cold that day. It started flurrying, I think, just maybe half an hour before noon. And the wind was picking up. And, since we're in the media stand, there's even more wind. So it was cold and everybody was bundled up. But even then, I feel like with all the security and just wandering around in the days before, it was a very safe place, I felt. And as the Washington bureau chief of Cronkite said, I feel like it was the safest place in the world to be, because their security, their office is within that perimeter, which is very nice to have, right? But yeah, it was just waiting for listening to inauguration on the speakers behind and around us, seeing different media and have a view of the White House, seeing the banner of Biden and Harris alongside the roads. There is, I can't even say enough how much security there was. I mean, there was somebody, I feel like, along Pennsylvania Avenue, which is right behind the White House. There's security probably every 30 feet. Somebody was there and always looking at your badge to make sure that you were allowed to be there as well.
One of the things that's striking is in years past, when you'd cover an event like this, you'd be writing a story, preparing a broadcast script. You were tweeting, and I thought your tweets were really insightful. And not only that, it gave readers and viewers a really quick way into a great view.
Yeah, and that's definitely what I wanted to do. I feel like that as a Diné woman, especially as just a Native female reporter, I think it was a totally different experience, especially just as an Indigenous reporter, because I don't feel like growing up, and maybe a lot of people feel this way, I don't really see the news through our lens, and that's exactly what we do. So I wanted to, and with inauguration now, nobody could go in, there's no public access except outside the first outside after the bag check. There were residents walking around, but still you wouldn't get a feel for what it was like inside. So that's what I wanted to make the readers feel like they were there. And it was just a very long day too, so I can understand how people could get lost between watching the TV, scrolling on social media, trying to see what was coming up next.
I want to ask about the indigenizing of the news and how that approach was taken. Full of Twitter almost immediately were all kinds of memes, and Indian Country not only took this event literally, but then they took it to the next level. I think, of course, of the stuff with Bernie Sanders and putting him in a trading post and all kinds of things. That must have been something really, just the vibrancy of that I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, it was. Indian Country is always quick to create these memes, and I was really, so even my own family started making memes, and I thought, what are you guys doing? It just shows how much humor we have, around, even at such a time like this.
The serious work of the new administration, already you're seeing executive orders, and it's going to be a flurry of activity to cover.
It definitely, it is going to be, but with the new White House press secretary, I think her press briefing was very informative last night. She was saying, how the transparency and the honesty is going to be a goal of theirs, and I think that's going to make it a little bit easier to cover, because for a while, for a long time, the press was just, out of the loop, didn't know what was going to happen. We would get schedules every day, but now we wouldn't. And now we would, excuse me.
We only have a minute left, but I do want to ask about how the COVID pandemic played into the coverage. Were there spacing requirements and different aspects of that?
Yes, there was. The hosts of us were trying to walk around and make sure everyone was wearing N95 masks, and if nobody was, They would give it to you. You had to wear either a surgical mask if you're wearing underneath a cloth mask if you had one. People were very distant, and even in the parade itself, I could tell that a lot of the marching bands that came through, and what I was reading with the University of Delaware and the Howard University, they had less people because they wanted to have COVID precautions. Even just watching Joe Biden and Kamala Harris walk through on foot behind the White House, you could see how everybody was spaced out and trying to keep their distance. I don't know if that he really kept to that when President Joe Biden came over to the press pool area and was shaking hands with somebody, but people tried their best to be celebratory, but also obey the precautions.
We can really see how that's setting a new tone. Thank you, Jourdan, for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with another edition tomorrow. I'm Mark Trahant.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.